Hello and welcome to another episode of the World War II podcast. I'm Angus Wallace. On the 6th of August 1945, Colonel Paul Tibbets, flying the Enola Gay, a B-29 Superfortress named after Tibbets' mother, dropped the first atomic bomb on the Japanese city of Hiroshima. The bomb, Little Boy, devastated the city, exploding with the energy of approximately 15 kilotons of TNT. The explosion instantly killed thousands of people, and in the next few months, tens of thousands more would die from the effects of burns, radiation sickness, and other injuries, compounded by illness and malnutrition. On the 9th of August, Nagasaki would be the next city to be hit by an atomic bomb. The effects of the atomic bomb shocked the US military. Even before the Japanese surrender, the US government and military had begun a secret propaganda and information suppression campaign to hide the devastating nature of these experimental weapons. For nearly a year, the cover-up worked, until New Yorker journalist John Hersey got into Hiroshima and managed to report the truth to the world. Hershey's story would shape the post-war narrative of the atomic bombs, and the US government's response has helped frame the justification for dropping the bombs, which comes down to us today. I'm joined by Leslie Bloom, author of the excellent Fallout, the Hiroshima cover-up, and the reporter who revealed it to the world. Just before we get started, I'd like to say a quick thank you to all those patrons of the podcast who support the show. Your backing is invaluable in helping me find the time to put the podcast together. If you're not already a patron and would like to help, go to patreon.com/WW2podcast. $1 or $2 from listeners like yourself goes a long way. Right, on to the main feature. Leslie, thanks for joining me. Let's start on the 6th of August and the dropping of Little Boy. I would assume the Japanese would send press and film crews to document the devastation of Hiroshima. I mean, it could potentially be a propaganda coup. How was the news handled in Japan?
You would think, but curiously, that's not really how it played out. Well, first of all, the destruction was so total, and nothing like this had ever been experienced before in the history of humanity, and has only been experienced one time after that in humanity with Nagasaki, right? So for a while it took the Japanese to figure out that this indeed was one bomb. When Tokyo was razed earlier that spring, it was, 100,000 people dead in Tokyo, and 14 or 16 square miles were firebombed. That was the work of hundreds of planes, right? So then, they're piecing together that this was indeed the handiwork of one bomb. And as photographers and filmmakers do get into Hiroshima, and they're documenting it, and 3 days later, Nagasaki also. I mean, the Japanese government is not allowing information about this to come out. They're repressing information that's coming out from the ground. And it was actually really confusing to Allied military observers, because they were listening to, radio reports about Hiroshima. And there was one radio report that said, it was hit by, an incendiary bomb. And at first the Allied observers were wondering, do they not understand what just happened to them? There was, confusion at first. So, the Japanese government is trying to figure out what the hell they're going to do and what's going on. So they're actually keeping that information quite quiet, with weird success. And then after the emperor surrenders, with the condition that he's allowed to stay on the throne, that's when a small torrent of Japanese media starts to come out, photographs, testimonies, and the international press is starting to pick up on those. So there's a period of time between mid-August and the end of August when Allied troops land and begin the occupation, where there is an information flow coming from Japanese sources about what happened on the ground in Hiroshima and Nagasaki. But as soon as MacArthur's people get in on the ground and start occupying, the game is over. They are not letting that information get out.
So from the American point of view, how much do the US military feed to the press? Because obviously this is a secret weapon, but it's clearly not a secret weapon once it's being used.
Well, yeah, I mean it's fascinating to see the U.S. really grapple with the publicity surrounding the bomb, because on one hand they want to advertise the hell out of it. They have the nuclear monopoly. They have this new toy. It's the deadliest weapon that's ever been created. And, they want their enemy to capitulate, but they also want their frenemies, their allies, i.e. the Soviet Union, to be scared and to know that they have this, and that, America now has the clear advantage. And so it's a tightrope walk, really, for them to figure out how much are they going to play up the destructiveness of it and the uniqueness of it and the unique horribleness of it with its, radioactive qualities. And how much of it they're going to downplay so they don't look like morally qualified victors.
The Walter Cronkite story amused me, where he read it on the news feed, whatever. I don't recall what the TNT tonnage was, and thought it must be nonsense, and wrote the story at 20 tons, thinking it can't be however many kilotons.
They're not hiding the might of the bomb, but what they did do is they painted it in conventional terms at first. And, Truman makes an announcement, and he says, look, we have just released a bomb that is the equivalent of 20,000 tons of TNT. And, Walter Cronkite, who then is a young reporter editor I think he's based in Brussels at that time, he's responsible for passing all the wire reports to his clients in that country. And he gets the announcement saying this is 20,000 tons of TNT, and he says this is impossible. Like they just, even after covering the war for 5 and 6 years, the most hardened war reporters could not imagine a weapon of this might. Nobody could, unless you had been privy to its development. So Walter Cronkite changed before he disseminated that wire report, changed it from 20,000 tons of TNT to 20 tons of TNT, because that's like it was the more probable, more reasonable and sensible TNT equivalent. And he said, with subsequent reports, my mistake became apparent. I mean, and everybody was quite stunned.
How restrictive, MacArthur gets in, I don't know, he's not as dictatorial as MacArthur in Japan, isn't he? How restrictive was the reporting on the aftermath of the bomb? I mean, do they give the press free rein to go to Hiroshima, or is it all very sanitized what they're allowed to be shown?
I mean, look, when they're first coming on shore in Japan in the final days of August, and they're getting ready for this, September 2nd surrender ceremony. I mean, there are thousands of Allied troops that are arriving, and with them are arriving, Western war correspondents who have been, today we would call it embedded, with the troops, but, then they were, accredited war correspondents. For a salty, hardcore few of them, like all they wanted was to get into Hiroshima, get into Nagasaki first, and get the story of what it looked like under the mushroom cloud, because everybody had seen the pictures of the mushroom clouds, and the military released a few pictures of the landscape destruction, but there was still like a weird disconnect in terms of international cognizance of what it was like to be on the receiving end of nuclear attack. So these reporters are getting in, and MacArthur's PRO, or press relations officers and press relations office, they were really stringent, and there was a system where the press and the military were uneasy allies, but they had been throughout the war. If you were an accredited war correspondent and you went against what your military unit wanted you to say, your accreditation could be revoked, you could be kicked out. And so for the most part, reporters towed the line. But, for these few reporters who wanted to get in, I mean, that relationship was about to be tested and ended in many of their cases. The atomic cities were restricted topics, but several intrepid reporters, Allied reporters, did make their way to Hiroshima and Nagasaki. One of them managed to get an alarming initial story out through London's Daily Express, and it was the title of it was Atomic Plague. Another one got into Nagasaki, George Weller, who was Chicago Daily News, and he was there at Ground Zero in Nagasaki. He wrote 10,000 words describing what he had seen on the ground there and the medical conditions. And, unfortunately for him, he got in after the atomic plague story got out. And MacArthur's team had been able to set up pretty quickly their censorship operation. And when the latter report on Nagasaki was sent up, it was intercepted and somehow, quote unquote, lost. So that report never saw the light of day. So MacArthur's, or SCAP, which is, Supreme Commander for the Allied Powers, which refers both to MacArthur and to his apparatus, SCAP wised up very quickly that this was going to be a huge story, a competitive story for reporters, and they put restrictions in really quickly, beginning with interceptions and then with literally corralling reporters back to Yokohama until they could figure out how to contain the story better.
Why do you think they were trying to keep a lid on I guess it's the sort of the long-term devastation, or that, you say the radiation poisoning? I mean, it occurred to me at the same time in Europe, you're teeing up the Nuremberg trials. I wonder if that was something on the American military's mind, thinking about, could they be accused of atrocities by using such a weapon? But that's just speculation. But why were they? Do we know why they were trying to downplay things?
As the war's victors, I don't think that they were worried about being strung up as war criminals, because they of how they were positioned after the war, right? But we did have former Secretary of War Henry Stimson. They were already concerned about the U.S.'s image after the fire raising of Tokyo, and he said very clearly, "We don't want to be seen as having outdone Hitler in atrocities to win this war." That was before they even dropped the bomb. And, there was enormous uneasiness among the decision makers, the architects of the bomb and the architects of bomb strategy about, how this would play in the world. And, they didn't go with the option of setting off a demonstration in an uninhabited area. They chose to use it on a city that was, it had military value as a target, but it had largely a civilian population. And they knew they were going to have to face outcry over that decision, even though, it was war ending. That leads back to one of the reasons why right from the beginning, there was a rush to portray the bomb as a conventional weapon. This is just more TNT. You've been seeing it for 6 years in pictures on front pages and in headlines. And, this is just a bigger, more hardcore bomb. But in reality, what they had done is they had dropped an experimental mega weapon on a largely civilian population, and the radiation from that experimental weapon was continuing to kill men, women, and children in the most horrific and unique way. And it just wasn't going to play well with the unqualified moral victory over the Japanese, over the fascists, over Nazis. So I think as they were grappling with how they wanted to tell the story and how much about the bomb they wanted to reveal and how much they wanted to cover up, they're erring on the side of covering up right from the very beginning.
Yeah. So presumably they're just hoping it sort of drops off the news agenda and it'll solve itself.
Which it does. Yeah. No. I mean, they were quite lucky because they were when you're wrapping up a world conflict, there are a lot of, competing headlines. Hundreds of journalists from around the world descended upon Japan to cover the September 2nd surrender ceremony. Hundreds of reporters. Dozens of those reporters stayed afterwards in Tokyo to be occupation reporters. I mean, every major publication and news source in the world had a bureau or a presence of some kind in Tokyo, but very few reporters were either able to get into the restricted cities, and sooner or later they became disinclined because there were so many other scoops. I mean, the scoop culture that pushed the first few reporters to try to get to Hiroshima and Nagasaki and break the story initially of what had happened there also is pushing their subsequent, their reporters on the ground there to pursue what's the next story. Is it, the war crimes of, Japanese officials, those trials? Is it the setting up, the positioning now of Japan as a potential ally in the burgeoning Cold War? That's another story. The rise of Japanese communism, that's another story. I mean, so they're all looking for the next scoop. It's pretty bananas how quickly they moved on.
I also thought that the sterile photographs that they're allowed to be shown from the start of just a flattened city with a couple of bits of brick buildings left, actually sort of, I wonder if that potentially took a lot of the oxygen out of the story, because it kind of says, big bomb, there you go, there's not much else to see. You've seen destroyed cities before, but this is flattened. This is a new type of flattened.
Yeah, but you can't really tell that from the pictures anyway. And besides, I mean, for a world population that had been inundated with photographs of flattened cities for a half a decade, every day there was a new rubble image on the front page of a paper. And so sooner or later, you're going to get anesthetized to that kind of imagery. And so, the military, U.S. government and military knew exactly what they were doing when they released landscape devastation pictures, because it gave the veneer of openness. But the fact of the matter is that the story was much bigger. The bomb was, again, uniquely destructive and horrific, and that story was suppressed.
So it's journalist John Hersey that picks up on that there might be something else, and he comes up with a different angle to view Hiroshima. Who is he? What's his background?
He is American, but he was born in China to missionary parents. And so he, has a strong background in Asian culture and politics. And I mean, those were his formative years. And eventually he comes back to America. His family raises him during the second round of teenage formative years. He's in the elite schools of America. He goes to the Hotchkiss School, which I guess is kind of like, our version of Eton. Then he goes to Yale. So he's an interesting combination of being an outsider in his own country, which makes him in many ways a quintessential observer, but he also has exquisite access within circles of power, whether that is the journalism world or having contacts, in the government eventually, because a lot of those roads lead back to Yale, where he had gone to school and where he was immensely popular, and where he was a member of the Skull and Bones Society, which is, a very, elite and exclusive club that, boasts a lot of our country's presidents and other titans of power. So he's an interesting combination of outsider and ultimate insider. And he had been a war correspondent for Time magazine throughout most of the war from 1939 or 1940 onwards. And he had also been, he had set up the Russia Bureau for Time. He had covered the war in Italy. He had covered the war in the Philippines. He's been all over the globe, at this point, and he has seen absolutely, the worst of human nature, as many war correspondents who are, career war correspondents, did. He's not in the Pacific Theater when the bombs are dropped. He's back in New York, and he has just left Time magazine, and he's trying to decide what he's going to do with his career. And then the news comes that the bomb has been dropped on Hiroshima. The rest of America is bath of ecstasy about it. And, and he's not. I mean, he looks at it and, he has seen the Japanese in battle, and he's desperate, the word on the ground then, and not just propaganda from the military, from the government, but the word on the ground from his colleagues, his reporter colleagues who are, in the Pacific, is that, the Japanese will fight to the last man. This war is going to go on, and it is going to be bloody until the very end. And so even though he's, taken aback by the news of the atomic bomb dropping in Hiroshima, he's there's a certain measure of relief at first also, because he thinks, well, at least it will speed the war's end. But then when the bomb on Nagasaki is dropped, he's horrified. I mean, he literally sees it as, potential war crime, and he thinks that Hiroshima would have done the trick, and he's probably right, it would have. And, there's a lot of debate about whether or not the surrender would have come without the dropping of either bombs. But Hersey, in the moment is horrified by Nagasaki. And he's in touch with friends of his who are covering the developments on the ground from the Pacific. He sits back and he watches the coverage for a while. And a few months later, he is having lunch with the New Yorker editor, William Shawn, and they are Hersey's about to go and do a big reporting trip for the New Yorker in Asia, starting in China. And they are talking about Hiroshima, and they cannot figure out at first what is driving them insane about the coverage of Hiroshima, because it seemed exhaustive at first. I mean, it was front page of every paper around the world, huge new devastating bomb. I mean, again, the veneer of candidness was total. I mean, it was very successful. But they knew, Hersey and William Shawn knew that something was missing from it. And finally, they put their finger on what it was. And all you were hearing about was landscape devastation, how many buildings had been wiped out, the square mileage that had been wiped out. I mean, the lack of human element to the reporting, all of a sudden, when they figured out what was missing, it was quite startling to them. So they decided that Hersey would try to get into Japan, get into Hiroshima, and tell the story of what it was like to be a human, what happened to the human beings who were on the receiving end of the world's first nuclear attack.
How hard does he find it to get in? I mean, do they try to keep him out? Being, sometimes you don't want the specialist coming back. You want to take in you let in the rookie, the green journalist, to sniff the story, thinking you can keep them at arm's reach. Does he have problems getting back into Tokyo?
Well, Hersey hadn't been in Japan since before the war. By the time Hersey's trying to get in, which is winter and spring of 1946, MacArthur and SCAP, his apparatus have had they are in full control of that country. They're in control of who comes in, who leaves, where you're allowed to go in the country. You have to apply for permission to travel, throughout the country. You're given X number of days. And there was, a joke that went around that, SCAP told you how many cigarettes you could smoke, how much, you could eat. I mean, it was like really, really stringent. FBI was on the ground there. I mean, it was a really, really tightly run ship. So, there were some reporters who never would have been able to get in to the MacArthur's kingdom. And by the way, MacArthur and his teams every day they're getting press reports on the activities of the correspondents who are in the occupation forces there. And so they not only know who's on the ground reporter wise, but they know where they are, whether their wives are with them. They monitor every bit of reporting that these people are. I mean, there are monthly reports on the tenor of, the coverage by magazine to magazine or newspaper to newspaper. And MacArthur had, ones that he hated. But Hersey, in a way, he's kind of a perfect Trojan horse of a reporter to get in. He's played ball as a war reporter throughout. I mean, he seems like he's a pretty good bet. He wrote a pretty laudatory biography of MacArthur during the war called Men en Baton. And he later said that he wished that he could take that biography out of print because it was too complimentary to MacArthur. But I mean, MacArthur and his team would have liked that, right? I mean, so they're saying, he's still an ally, even though, we're out of wartime censorship and the code of honor that bonded reporters and military during the war has loosened a little bit. So Hersey's over in China doing some initial reporting. And he's being evaluated to find out whether he's going to be permitted to come into Japan or not. And he seems like a good bet. But then, there is a potential red flag. And that is, Hersey started the Moscow Bureau for Time. And, so his background is being vetted for any potential communist sympathy. Eventually, the calculus falls in his favor. And he is notified that he's been given permission and military transport to come into Japan. That doesn't mean that when he gets there, he's going to be free to do what he wants. It just means he's been approved for entrance. And, at that time, not only does SCAP know that he's coming in and he's been thoroughly vetted, but even the FBI back in Washington is notified that he's coming in, and requests for background information on him are going in. But again, he's been considered to be probably not a threat. And, the joke would end up being on MacArthur and his people, ultimately, for making that decision.
I mean, he seems to get a fairly free run at Hiroshima. In a city that's devastated, how difficult is it for, an independent journalist to operate? I mean, presumably simple facilities such as hotels, restaurants, they're non-existent. So how can he operate without military assistance in what he's doing?
You can't. That's the thing. I mean, that's why you have to be considered, a good bet. And, I mean, if the military thinks that you're going to just be there and, doing innocuous reporting, or that you can be controlled, then you can have the access, because ultimately no scandalous reporting is going to come, out of it. So, Hersey gets into Japan. They give him 2 weeks to travel down to Hiroshima Prefecture. Remember, in Japan, you're not getting anywhere without military ration gasoline if you're driving in a Jeep, or, a train for which you need a pass to get on the train, military approved pass. When you get down to Hiroshima, I mean, like, it is flat still. It is still a sea of rubble. And yes, the streets have been cleared so people can ride bicycles with improvised tires through them. But I mean, it's still a hot mess, and people have been starving down there. So if you're going to eat anything when you're down there, you're not getting food from the Japanese. You're getting it from whatever military occupation is there. Luckily for Hersey, by the time he's given permission to get down to Hiroshima, the bulk of the military presence that was put in there initially has been withdrawn, but there's still military police presence. So he bunks with them. Look, we have to remember also that by the time Hersey actually does get to Hiroshima, it's 7 or 8 months after the bombs, and it's been a long time since there was a fever pitch of interest of what had happened on the ground in Hiroshima. Editors are now considering it an old story. They feel like it's done and dusted. Hersey's not down there broadcasting what he's writing about. He's just there. He's an interested correspondent who's been in the Asian theater, having a look around. He and his editor back at the New Yorker have decided that they're going to write the story of Hiroshima back on American soil. So it's not like he's writing something that will be censored or could be taken away from him. He's just observing. And so, again, this would ultimately blindside the government and military officials who would give him access. But in the moment, I mean, he's considered to be, an ally to the mission on the ground there and MacArthur's operation.
Does he have a plan on who he wants to speak to, the type of people he's wanting to talk to?
So back in New York, when Hersey and William Shawn decided that they were going to try to show the human element, they zeroed in on the idea of telling it from the point of view of survivors. And Hersey, when he got over to Asia, still wasn't quite sure about how he was going to game that out. But then, the idea occurs to him that he will try to find the stories of a handful of survivors, blast survivors, that is, whose lives have intersected before the bomb and intersected in the hours and the days and the weeks after the bomb went off. These are not military figures. They are average citizens. And so when he gets to Hiroshima, and he's more or less given free rein to walk around and talk to people, with the help of initially a Catholic German priest who was on the ground, who spoke English, who makes introductions for him. He starts interviewing dozens of people, blast survivors who are there. And eventually he finds 6 protagonists whose lives intertwined before the bomb went off and, somehow miraculously survived, and whose paths crossed in the hours and the days after the bombing, so he could really keep the narratives intertwined. And his idea was to really bring the narrative down to this granular human level. Because look, even today, you might not understand what makes the bomb work, and you might not be able to picture what nuclear apocalypse looks like. But anybody, and especially in 2020, can understand what it's like to be a citizen, a mother, a doctor, a clerk, whose life is suddenly upended by catastrophe. And so Hersey's idea was to portray the bomb through this very granular point of view, in the hopes that it would create empathy in readers, and to really put them in the moment of, what it had been like for these people to be on the receiving end of nuclear attack. The only humans in history to have ever had that horrific experience.
It's the one that particularly shocked me was Dr. the 25-year-old Dr.
Sasaki.
Yeah, who's the only doctor to survive at the hospital. That's just more and more people keep flooding in, and there's just him sort of struggling on. It's horrific.
I've read quite a few translated testimonies of Japanese doctors and medics who had survived. And you look, the proportions of doctors who died and were injured and nurses who died and injured. I mean, there were very few medical professionals left intact in the city to tend to the tens of thousands of people who tried to make their way to, the partially surviving buildings of hospitals and medical centers in Hiroshima and Nagasaki afterwards. And the conditions were absolutely horrific. I don't want to, be too graphic. It was a terrible scene. I mean, you can imagine being a sole medic. First, you run out of bandages, and then you run out of water, and the crowds keep coming. And then the fact of the matter is that many of the surviving medics, as the hours and the days went on, had no idea what they were dealing with. I mean, look, yes, burns, that's nothing new in a war, right? I mean, I think 66 cities in Japan were firebombed, so medics knew how to deal with burns. But what they were seeing coming in the patients coming in was totally unheard of. I mean, children with hair falling out, and the vomiting, and again, I won't go into all the other symptoms here, but at first they were wondering, is this dysentery? Is this some sort of bacterial something? Is this a gas attack? I mean, they were just going through the list of afflictions that it could have been, and then only gradually was it revealed that this was a different kind of weapon. This was a new and experimental kind of weapon. And one surgeon or one vice president of one hospital went down into the basement of his hospital to get X-ray plates, and he saw that they'd all been exposed already, which was a pretty strong hint that this bomb had some unusual qualities. So, I mean, these poor medics, not only are they completely overwhelmed by the sheer terrifying wave of humanity coming into their hospitals, many of whom are dying on the stairs outside the hospital before they can even get into the overcrowded hallways, but they have no idea how to treat them. And then they run out of all of the equipment to treat any affliction whatsoever. I mean, it's just basically becomes almost like a boarding house for the dying and the dead.
The descriptions are apocalyptic. It really is quite horrifying. But the peculiar thing is, it's the New Yorker magazine which is funding him to do this. Now, the New Yorker is set up to be, I know it to be, gay, humorous and satirical, which somehow seems the antithesis of what this article is going to be. So why are they picking it up?
Nothing satirical or frivolous or frolicsome about historical, for sure. It's one of the peculiar ironies of this story, right? I mean, look, at the time when Hersey got into the ground, the New York Times had a bureau, AP had a bureau, UP had a bureau. I mean, everybody had a bureau on the ground, but it is the New Yorker magazine that decides that they are going to be the one to tell this story. And the New Yorker's co-founding editor, Harold Ross, who, commissioned along with William Shawn Hersey's reporting trip. The New Yorker had, to a certain extent, flipped to a war reporting magazine during the war because there was just no option. I mean, they're not going to run a funny magazine during the war. As Harold Ross said, nothing feels funny anymore. And he and William Shawn had both been hardcore reporters before the New Yorker, and so it really brought out the news hound in each of them, and they were quite competitive editors also, which I loved. But Harold Ross was really rattled because, he at the end of the war, he had had a ton of correspondence in the field, in Europe and in the Pacific. And he wrote to one of them and he said, the war is going to be over before any number of atrocity stories are told. Once the war is over, if the atrocity stories aren't told, most of them aren't going to get told. And that really bothered him. And so when Hersey and Shawn and Ross realized that they have their teeth not only on, a really crucial atrocity story, but arguably what they and what many of their colleagues throughout the news industry consider to be the biggest story of modern times, which is, man has invented the means with which to destroy civilization. Man, they go after that story. And they're like, you know what? If nobody else is going to tell it, is willing to tell it, or able to tell it, we are going to be the ones to tell it, and nobody is going to see it coming because it's the New Yorker.
The anniversary of it in August 46. So if we take the New Yorker out, does anybody else come close to touching? Well, I presume it's mentioned in the press in August 46, the anniversary of the dropping of the bomb, or does something else eclipse it?
So when I was researching this aspect of the story, I was trying to figure out how much competition were Hersey and his team anticipating, in terms of like what were other major publications with way more firepower going to run. So my researcher and I are looking, into the coverage at comparable publications, whether it's Life or Time or the New York Times, and the coverage for the anniversary is pitiful and kind of, it was just shocking. I think, Time magazine had a totally bizarre item saying, that there was, were celebrations in Hiroshima and that there was some big sale that everybody was taking advantage of at a local department store. And there was, some crazy lantern dance that was happening. And, meanwhile, we have just seen what Hiroshima looks like. It's flat. These people are eating rice. If you get it. There is not a major party happening to celebrate, the 1-year anniversary. So the New Yorker team was pretty grimly fortunate in terms of the lack of other coverage that was done. And then, Hersey's article comes out a couple of weeks later, and man, it blows everybody out of the water. And it's revelations about the reality of aftermath of nuclear war is humiliating, not just for the U.S. government and military, because it's been very obvious that they've covered up the reality and they're responsible for the misery that Hersey is portraying. But it's also humiliating for the press, for the international press, because everybody had access to this story. Nobody reported it like Hersey did. And as Harold Ross Hersey's, the editor-in-chief of the New Yorker, said to one of his other correspondents, how easy it is to scoop the world. And they essentially scooped the world.
What surprised me, though, is because the New Yorker is presumably a limited print run, so once it's gone, it's gone. But it does actually seem to, rather than people taking umbrage, the story seems to be syndicated and passed around the world and get bigger than the New Yorker itself. I was surprised at how big it becomes, if that makes sense. When the BBC are running plays about it. Is it radio plays they run on?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, it's a 30,000 word article. Okay, so it's pretty major. And, ABC Radio read the entire article. They had actors, very subdued actors, read the entire thing over 4 nights. And then the BBC reads the entire thing over 3 or 4 nights subsequently. You're right. It's not a foregone conclusion that this article would have gotten the support that it did, but it was syndicated in its entirety in newspapers and magazines around the world. Every place from China to Jerusalem to, in South American countries. Well, for the most part, there were exceptions to this, but instead of, sniping or jealousy or competitive jealousy, most reporters and editors tipped their hats to the story and to Hersey and to his team, because, there was jealousy and resentment that he had gotten that story and he had seen something that they had overlooked. They were negligent, but they still acknowledged the beauty of the story, the effectiveness of the story, and the importance of the story. And so articles ran it. And even articles that could not syndicate a 30,000 word article still covered the hell out of it. There are, editorials across the country and around the world about its importance and about the revelations, not just of, again, the reality of the aftermath, but also the fact that the U.S. government had not been straight with the American people or with the world about the nature of the bomb that it had created in secret and dropped in the Americans' name without any sort of consultation. And so the fallout was quite considerable.
So what is the US government's reaction? Because in some respects, I thought it might strengthen their hand demonstrating the long-term effects, actually saying how much more dangerous their bomb is.
Well, so that's the ironic thing, right? So, on one hand, the big reveal about, the extent to which they'd covered it up is embarrassing to them. They're not thrilled at being caught out. And there's major scrambling. And again, even though Hersey had been given military permission to be on the ground in Hiroshima. The FBI in Japan and America both knew he was on the ground there. But still the story blindsides American officials, right? Because they just don't see it coming from their dutiful correspondent who had been such a good ally during, war coverage. At the same time, Hiroshima has a certain value that Hersey and his editors anticipated, but it wasn't the point of their article. The point of their article was, the expose, right? This is what it's actually like, and this is what these weapons are really like, and why they should probably never be used again, right? But for the U.S. government, a year after the fact, they're, in a full-on Cold War with the Soviet Union, and from a certain point of view, first of all, it really reminds the Soviets, look what we have and you don't. You're at our disadvantage. And secondly, part of Hersey's goal in the article was to get American readers to put themselves in the shoes of the people who had been attacked, to create an empathy and to visualize themselves under attack. And so his goal was to reduce support for these weapons. But at the same time, that kind of empathy had a certain advantage for government officials, because if people could imagine themselves under attack in that way, because nuclear monopoly for the U.S. was not going to be forever, everybody knew that, they might support the idea that we actually need bigger and better nuclear bombs. Because, if somebody, we need to be in the position to do preemptive attacks. So we are never in this position. And so they were able to see a certain kind of value, unintended value in Hiroshima, too. And on the note of Hiroshima intimidating the Soviets by showing how extensive and awful the fallout from nuclear bombs really was, the Russians the Soviets really hated Hersey and Hiroshima after that came out.
It's Henry Stimson writes there is an official rebuttal, or is it a justification rather than rebuttal? Response is possibly a better way of putting it. How does Stimson defend or justify dropping the atomic bomb?
The government officials decide that Hiroshima, as in Hersey's article, needs to be addressed, and the response needs to be addressed, but in a really cool-headed sort of way, because they don't want to be seen as being on the defensive. Like they want to immediately reassert a position of steady-handed, cool-minded authority. And so the Secretary of War, Henry Stimson, who retired right after the war finished, is called into service to be the figurehead author of this article, even though what one biographer called the Old Boys War Department Network really, went to work on it. There was quite a team of co-authors. So they created for Harper's a cover story that lay out what they billed as being the official justification for having dropped the bombs. And they just kept trying to bring it back to their talking points. They wanted the imagery of, the tens of thousands of civilians, who were been, scalded and who were racked with radiation sickness to disappear. So when Hersey says 100,000 people have died, there's a very human element to it. But when they want to bring back the retelling to a more clinical 100,000. They just want you to think of the number. They don't want you to think of the imagery. So the argument is, if we didn't drop the bombs, we would have had to do a land invasion. It would have cost 1 million lives, even though that was not an accepted number even within the administration. It would have cost hundreds of thousands of Japanese lives and American lives. It was therefore the humane thing to do, even for the Japanese. They also asserted that it spared the Japanese civilians months of having their harbors blockaded from further starvation. The government had not dropped a demonstration because they didn't actually know if it was a demonstration bomb, because they didn't know if it was going to work or not, and nothing would have been more destructive to the effort to end the war than if the bomb had been a dud and the U.S. had been laughing stock. So it had to be in their retelling. It had to be dropped on a city, an inhabited city. So it was all about bringing it back to these talking points. Dropping the bombs had been necessary to end the war and to save lives. So some Americans were very reassured by this when this article came out, a few months later on February 1947. And, they could feel okay within their own consciences again, that it hadn't been so bad, that this was morally justifiable after all. But the fact is that they didn't, the authors of the rebuttal article didn't address any of the real revelations of Hersey's article. And that is that they had dropped an experimental weapon on a civilian population. It didn't use the word radioactive once in their long article. I mean, it did not address any of the revelations about the particular horrors of this bomb. It also didn't address the fact that the U.S. government had covered up the reality of the bomb. And so the damage was really done. I mean, the genie was out of the bottle. It wasn't going to be stuffed back in.
The fascinating thing about that article is how much of it is still very much the narrative of the justification of the bombs today. It certainly has struck a chord, and that's what. Oh no, the bombs saved more lives than they destroyed. Is sort of the base argument that still, all this time later, still comes down to us. Do we know how Hersey felt about dropping the atomic bomb? I mean, he'd seen combat against the Japanese. It's almost he's seen both sides of the fence. I mean, I wondered if we know after the fact how he felt about it.
Well, when he first hears the news about Hiroshima, he's conflicted because he's horrified by the extent of the damage and by what it portends for the future that this kind of a weapon exists. But at the same time, part of him feels that he had firsthand witnessed what he called the tenacity of the Japanese in battle. And again, the predominant narrative of that moment, and that's coming not just from military officials, allied military officials, but also his fellow reporters in the field, is that the Japanese would fight to the last man, right? So he feels of deeply qualified relief because he thinks that it will speed the end of the war. 3 days later, when the U.S. bombs Nagasaki, he's horrified because for him it's a very significant step too far, and it's criminal in his opinion. He says it was just totally criminal, and that there had not been sufficient time given after the bombing of Hiroshima for the Japanese government to get its stuff together and make its decision about its surrender. So he's tortured especially by the second bomb, and again what it says for the future. And at that point he knows that he's going to write in some capacity about the bombings. He just doesn't know in what capacity he's going to write about it yet, what the exact topic is, but he knows that with the dropping of those bombs we have shifted into a new chapter of human civilization, and he is not encouraged by what he sees. That
seems like a good place to end. Thank you, Leslie. Folks, if you want to read more about John Hersey and the US cover-up of the devastation caused by the atomic bombs, the book to read is Fallout, the Hiroshima cover-up and the reporter who revealed it to the world. As I said at the start, it's excellent and possibly the best book I've read this year. In the next episode, we'll be looking at Admiral Bertram Ramsay, the mastermind behind Dunkirk and D-Day. Until then, I'm Angus Wallace, and thanks for listening.